Force 13 presents the top 10 forgotten cyclones that should be famous. One of the strongest typhoons to ever hit Tokyo. The first billion-dollar storm in the Western Pacific. And one of the deadliest storms in Thailand's history. Over the years, over 15,000 tropical cyclones have been recorded around the world, many of them with varying intensities, varying amounts of danger, and obviously varying impacts. Of course, to many people though, they'd be astonished to know that the number of tropical cyclones that form every year is nearly 100, but we only ever hear about a few of these. Most cyclones get forgotten. Some of them have a better case to be remembered than others though, and we've picked out our top 10 this year for our top 10 most forgotten cyclones that we think should be famous. Kyushu, October 1951. Whilst post-war Japan was rebuilding, the nuclear arms race was gathering pace, with the Korean War raging not very far away either. A different kind of explosion, however, was on its way, and that came in the form of Typhoon Ruth. The storm first developed not far from Guam, passing to the south and then moving northwest through the rest of the western Pacific Ocean and becoming quite a formidable, strong Category 4 with winds near 150 miles per hour according to our latest estimates. The storm then rapidly arrived on the main islands of Japan, causing significant surge issues and of course flooding later on as well, which was the reason for most of the fatalities from this storm. Significant damage occurring as well, partly due to the surge. A lot of ships were involved in damages as well, and as you can see there, our pressure estimate 924 millibars. Over 1,200 were killed by this storm, the 180th highest tally worldwide. But look at the buildings damaged and destroyed, really high numbers there into the hundreds of thousands and quite high in the rankings. 2,600 were injured by this storm as well due to all of its impacts, mainly again the flooding and water related issues, and 639 millimeters of rainfall over some parts of Japan, which is a moderate to relatively high amount. Going by those numbers, it's quite clear that Typhoon Ruth has been a forgotten storm, forgotten mainly due to world events at the time, and there are stronger, much stronger typhoons in that year as well, Typhoon Marge being the main candidate. That's why Ruth is number 10 on my top 10 forgotten storms. Over the years, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, has been putting together a database called HERDAT, discovering and exploring all of the Atlantic storms and hurricanes that occurred from 1851 onwards. However, the period between 1851 and 1898 was re-evaluated by Michael Chenoweth in 2014 and discovered quite a few other storms in the books. Force 13's own independent analysis has taken a look at all of the storms as well and went along with most of those changes. They're reflected in these charts. A little bit of context here around this 1870 storm. As it turns out, this particular storm is the first one that we can really say since 1851 that reached Category 5 status with a good degree of certainty. It should be mentioned that there are some storms from before the 1851 period that also likely reached Category 5 status, but this is the first one that occurred in the official database's time period, even though it isn't quite official. So we saw the track of the storm there, which passed through Cuba, intensified after leaving the island, and became a Category 5 just to the north of Cuba, almost in the Straits of Florida. The storm then turned post-tropical as it moved off towards the North Atlantic Ocean, way off to the north. 160 miles per hour at peak, and a pressure estimate of 914 millibars, and it was quite a deadly storm as well, no less than 2,000 fatalities, 144th highest worldwide. Roughly 200 buildings damaged, 200 destroyed as far as we know, it may be higher. In terms of monetary damage, $12 million in damages, and that's back then quite a number, although only the 900th highest worldwide. This storm is certainly one that I would say has been forgotten. It's one that would absolutely terrify the pants off Floridians if it happened today, because it was stalling just off the coast of Cuba as a Category 5. Well, usually in the South Pacific, storms tend to go either poleward or westwards towards the Australian coast, but sometimes the steering currents can get very weak, storms can curve around all over the place, but very rarely do we actually see storms travel from west to east. That happened not once, not twice, but 3 times within just a few days, as 3 storms paraded effectively the wrong way. The first one was Cyclone Eric, which approached Fiji and made landfall near major hurricane equivalent status. This was followed by the storm that we're covering, Nigel, and then behind that by Odette, a remarkable 3 parade of storms that were doing questionable things in the South Pacific. We're focusing on the strongest storm, Nigel. It formed in the middle of January in the Coral Sea, 2 of 3 systems that were moving through this area at the same time. Strengthened rapidly as it approached Vanuatu, reaching Category 4 status briefly, then making landfall as a Category 3, then moving on to Fiji, where it struck the northern part of Viti Levu as a Category 3 as well, and then down through Tonga, and then on towards the east a little bit further, but dying out very quickly afterwards. So a fascinating storm, and it's what we've attributed most of the impacts to, even though it may have occurred from 2 of those storms, particularly in Fiji and also in Vanuatu, both of those island nations suffering. Well, the storm eventually died off, its remnants at least, as it was heading towards New Zealand. It reached 130 mph winds and lasted for just 5 days. In total, 28 fatalities, which is quite high for this region, 10,000 buildings damaged, which is very high for this region as a matter of fact, possibly one of the highest, certainly in this era in the South Pacific. In terms of monetary damages, $50 million, making it the 637th highest worldwide. Well, it's another storm from that period of history in the Western Pacific that's been largely forgotten, the 1950s. And this was Typhoon Virginia, which formed in June and really starting to intensify rather quickly as it entered the Philippine Sea, and look at just how strong it managed to get, reaching Category 5 status just after the summer solstice, getting very close to the Philippines, and then swiping the eastern coast of Taiwan pretty much from bottom to top, making landfall as a Category 3 just after losing Category 5 status, then weakening quite significantly in the East China Sea, and most of its passage over Japan was as a remnant low. Look at that though, 175 miles per hour at peak, and estimated pressure, according to our estimate, 899 millibars. It was already a wet period for Japan, and this storm exacerbated issues. Whilst the storm was stronger in Taiwan, not much is known about actual impacts, and it was probably on the lower side given that it was on the eastern, quieter side of the country. All in all, the storm killed at least 86, caused serious damage to 129,000 buildings, which is in the top 100 worldwide, and destroyed completely 1,000 of them. $20 million in damages, which is probably underestimated given those damages in numbers. For our next storm, we're digging deep into the history books, back to the distant past before the modernized records began. Back to 1917, where we still had typhoons, believe it or not, and Tokyo was one of the cities vulnerable to typhoon impact, with it being a very crowded city at that point, of a population already over 2 million. Well, this particular storm was sending a significant warning shot towards the region. Typhoon 10 back in 1917 reached winds of at least 115 miles per hour and a pressure of 952 millibars. That's a category 3 on the Saffir-Simpson scale, and it headed straight for Japan's capital. It struck Tokyo at category 3 intensity, one of only 2 or 3 storms to ever do that, as a matter of fact, meaning that it is one of Tokyo's strongest impacting storms ever. So taking a look at the actual death toll, it was 1,324, a very high number. Buildings damaged and destroyed also very high, both in the top 100 worldwide ever. And 2,000 were injured by this storm as well, another high toll. It was one of 2 storms that caused 1,000 fatalities in this typhoon season, the other being Typhoon 12, which also struck Japan. So we'd got to 1974 in the Western Pacific, and that typhoon season would obviously go down later on, for those who don't know, to be one of very, very few seasons that didn't feature a Category 5 storm. We've tried our hardest through the analysis to try and find a storm that managed to get to Category 5 status and put it among almost every other Western Pacific season that's actually had one. But alas, it was not found. The strongest storm was Typhoon Gloria, which got to around 150 miles per hour, just squeaking super typhoon status. Now, when we go through the history of the Western Pacific and the most damaging storms up until that point, if we look at monetary damage alone, of course, well, Typhoon Vera really set that standard very high back in 1959 when it really devastated Japan, of course. It caused $600 million in damages, and at that point we were wondering when we would see our first billion-dollar storm. That happened in the 1950s in the Atlantic. When would it happen over there in the Western Pacific? Well, as it happened, it took a while for any more storms to get anywhere near. We had Typhoon Nancy in 1961, which did get to $500 million in damages, and in more recent years, pretty quiet. Only Typhoon Rita in 1972 got anywhere marginally close, getting to $445 million in damages with its very erratic track. Of course, typhoons were setting records or near records in other ways in the years leading up to 1974. We had Typhoon Nora the previous year, which was an extremely powerful storm and underestimated officially, probably in the 870s millibars, lower 870s as a matter of fact, potentially. And with winds well over 200 miles per hour, but thankfully Nora didn't really impact land as badly as it could have. So fast forward to 1974, and now we have Typhoon Gilda, which is heading towards Japan. Gilda was quite unassuming really in its nature. It did get rather strong and was quite large as well, but what really contributed to major damage in Japan, even though it never really properly made landfall over the main islands of Japan, it moved off towards the west. It sidled past the coast of Kyushu and then brushed the southeastern part of South Korea. But what was happening in days leading up to this storm's impact, heavy rainfall, originally not from the storm itself. We'll see some satellite images. But a lot of cloudiness over Japan as the storm was trailing its way upwards, and then the storm itself arrived, and in some locations it's hard to tell on the satellite images, but certainly to me it looks like over parts of central and towards the western part of Japan there were some concentrations of cloud that just stayed there over several days, and that contributed to enormous amounts of rainfall for parts of the country. And as we know in Japan, what often happens, torrential landslides which can cause very hazardous conditions and significant impacts. So as it happened in the end, Typhoon Gilda became the first billion-dollar disaster in the Western Pacific, and not only stopping at 1 billion, it got a little bit further as well. 1.5 billion was the final total, even though it never actually made landfall in the places that it affected the most. So with its huge flooding, here are the numbers: 154 fatalities in total from Gilda. But look at the amount of buildings damaged, over 148,000, the 79th highest worldwide. Not so many destroyed, although limited data. In terms of millions of dollars in damages, well, it's 1,500, 1.5 billion, 127th highest worldwide, and 171 injured by this storm. Pretty much everyone knows about the enormous shadow that was cast over the North Indian Ocean in 1970 when we had the Bhola Cyclone, widely regarded as the most deadliest storm in world history, killing up to 500,000 people in mainly the Ganges River Delta. And in the aftermath of that storm, which took a long time, it destabilized countries. East Pakistan, as it was back then, now Bangladesh. This cyclone was a major catalyst to unrest and what eventually led to the founding of Bangladesh. During the course of 1971, which is when all of this was going on, another quiet cyclone season at first until we got to the strongest storm of the year. And this is very much a forgotten storm because it's another one that impacted a similar area. This storm, not as strong as the Bhola Cyclone, but it did get to Category 2 status, we believe, with a peak wind estimate around 105 miles per hour. It didn't strike the Ganges River Delta dead on, but it did strike the coast of Orissa, as it was back then, making landfall not far from Paradip, and then moving inland, and then scooting off towards the east. It was much weakened by that point, but then it did end up over West Bengal and over the Ganges River Delta, Bangladesh, all of that area involved. So another storm that caused severe impacts in all of these areas, and by some metrics may have even been more damaging than the Bhola Cyclone. Thankfully, and hopefully, I assume, I don't actually know, but I assume that communications were much better by this point, obviously with the fact that they had that massive storm the year before, that people were a bit more on alert, and thankfully the fatality number wasn't quite so high, but still in this area 10,000 fatalities caused by this storm. Another reminder that the average North Indian Ocean storm is 10 times deadlier than the average Atlantic storm. In terms of buildings damaged and destroyed, it's in the top 20 on both in cyclone history and in the top 100 for fatalities. $30 million of damages at the time. It was probably higher, and of course this was back in 1971, so certainly more in today's money. And finally, onto a storm that Force 13 actually covered in my much earlier days, Typhoon Fitow, which, as you can see from Force 13's first update on the storm, it was forecasted to go entirely somewhere else.
And the Mariana Islands, currently in the Western Pacific, out in the open ocean at the moment, currently with winds of 40 miles per hour and a pressure of 996 millibars. Current positions 13.8 degrees north, 132.2 degrees east. Expected to move towards the north over the next few days, intensifying gradually along the way, becoming a typhoon in the next 36 to 48 hours. The GFS model staying true to what it said earlier today, moving into Kyushu Island in Japan, and then eventually brushing South Korea, probably making landfall there as well.
It was my first year doing full coverage of tropical cyclones in the northern hemisphere. Eventually it became around the world by the end of that year. And of course Typhoon Fitow, quite an impressive storm in terms of what it did in the end, but at the time that really wasn't recognized so much, at least by myself. I was still quite young. You can hear my very, very unpolished voice on the videos, and you'll note that I'll note that it was a bit more of a mindset back then, not just with me but across the board, that weaker storms don't do very much. It was still, of course we've had storms in the past like Tropical Storm Allison, but I'd say in the last 10 to 15 years in particular we've become much more aware of what the weaker storms can do, as well as the more stronger headline grabbers.
I definitely think it's been forgotten about. and it was completely overshadowed a month later by Typhoon Haiyan. Because if Typhoon Haiyan never happened, then maybe like Typhoon Fitow would be more prominent in the news. But like because of Haiyan, Fitow's like destruction in China was overshadowed from the destruction on the Philippines from Haiyan.
As we saw in that first forecast, the modelling was showing the storm going the wrong way, heading towards Kyushu and into Korea. Of course, the storm didn't end up doing that in the end. However, this was rectified in the modelling forecasts and, of course, the official forecasts by the third update that we did on Typhoon Fitow.
For the storms forming behind it, the GFS model is somewhat similar, a little bit more towards the north, towards the official forecast, passing through Miyako Island and then eventually making landfall in China, south of Shanghai. In the next few days as it moves towards China, it won't be that intense, at least we've probably seen it peak now, but it will be a gradual weakening process, and Taiwan could well receive some typhoon conditions. China, as a small possibility, may see a typhoon landfall.
Of course, Fitow was by far away from becoming the strongest storm of the season. It was extremely overshadowed, not just by Typhoon Haiyan, but also, even if Haiyan didn't exist, there were other Category 5s that year that didn't impact land, albeit. Then you have big storms like Typhoon Danas, which was small but more powerful, Category 4, looked very pretty moving through the Ryukyu Islands at a very similar time to Fitow, as a matter of fact. So this storm was sort of seen more as a nuisance, one that we wanted to scrub off our hands, but as it happened, when the storm made landfall in China only as a tropical storm in the end and then moved inland, it caused major flooding impacts and structural failures and impacts, which caused serious problems in highly developed or populous areas just south of Shanghai. So this storm turned out to be a massive financial toll, as well as a human toll as well in the end. So in total, this storm did cause only, in inverted commas, 12 fatalities, but it's the damages that really catch the numbers. Nearly 100,000 buildings damaged, the 121st highest on record, and 27,000 destroyed. But in monetary damage, it is in the top 25 at $10.4 billion. And one of the highest still in the Western Pacific, and a very wet storm, 803 millimeters of rain. Typhoon Vera has quite a history in the Western Pacific. 30 years prior to this storm, the same name struck Japan in the Issawan Typhoon, one of the most powerful and well-known typhoons in Japan's history. This one, however, looked pretty meagre on satellite imagery, barely reaching Category 1 status, struggling with wind shear for a lot of its life as well, before striking China as a strong tropical storm. It looked pretty pathetic, and most people would not give it a second look. However, it's when we look at the numbers in terms of Chinese impacts that this situation gets particularly baffling.
It looked a bit rubbish, so to speak. I mean, like, it wasn't that interesting. It's just an average tropical storm, really. It was moving very quickly. Like, the whole of its life was moving very quickly until it had made landfall. Then it started to slow down and veer off to the north.
The storm first developed in the middle of September, not too far from the northern Mariana Islands, did a little loop there and became a tropical storm, crossed over the Philippine Sea and then became briefly a Category 1 typhoon equivalent, and then making landfall as a weakened tropical storm to the south of Shanghai, and then swirling round, moving quickly all along the way, as you'll note there, and then moving out as an extratropical cyclone, peak wind speeds of 75 miles per hour, pressure peak 980 millibars. So how is it that this storm became one of the most damaging on worldwide records? Well, let's take a look at the wind field for any potential clues here. Was it a large storm? Well, the answer here is quite a coherent no. The wind field wasn't particularly large at all and was gone completely after it made landfall. So, is there any other contributing factors? Well, there is potentially one. Typhoon Sarah impacted the area just a few days before Vera was on the horizon, and that also produced quite a lot of rain over the area. No doubt Vera exacerbated matters, and rainfall after that storm may have also been accidentally attributed to this particular storm. It was a very wet period in eastern China at this point, and so all signs point to it being a culmination of actions from the weather to have caused such impacts. So what were the actual numbers? Well, they were extraordinary in terms of raw buildings damaged and destroyed. It's in the millions. 2.7 million buildings damaged, the highest ever recorded, and 3.1 million destroyed, the second highest worldwide. Along with that, 550 fatalities in all, which is also a significant number. And taking a look at actual monetary damage there, $351 million in damages, which is around mid to high end of this time period.
Yeah, I think it's worth adding that people also probably a lot more, a lot less keen to prepare for the storm, as it was only, you could say only a tropical storm, and it was getting there quite quickly, so it was going to pass in a few days. People probably weren't expecting much from it, but then it did end up killing well into the hundreds of people. I think it was pretty deadly.
So this is number one on the most forgotten storms. I think one, it's regrettable that it is so forgotten, to the extent that we've only discovered this storm in the last couple of years. And two, that even after this compilation top 10, it's probably going to be the least memorable of our top 10 list. And that is because there's very little to show for it. There's very little record of it. There's very little pictures, video, anything that we can find from this storm, when in fact it was quite an interesting storm in how impactful it was, and of course in the backdrop of what was going on in the world in this period. So it was towards the end of 1942, it was nearly a year after the Japanese invaded Thailand on the 8th of December 1941, and by which point Thailand eventually bowed really and became allies of Japan and declared war with the Allies. So at this point Thailand was under major strain from both sides. And of course by this point they were starting to build the Burma Railway further north, and a lot of other things that were going on, including allied bombings of Thailand. So we've got all of this to contend with, and now we've got this massive typhoon that appears out of nowhere in a place that very rarely gets strong typhoon landfalls. Well, here it is, at least a category 3 when it made landfall on the eastern coast of southern Thailand and then moved through the peninsula. It caused major fatalities and destruction as far as we know as it did this. The only number we can see quoted is 11,000, which would make it the deadliest typhoon since the Fitow typhoon in 1922. The storm not only did that, but then it started all over again in the Andaman Sea and probably became a category 3 again on approach to India, where it made landfall in the end, not far from Puri if I'm not mistaken, and caused a few hundred more deaths there. Then it moved inland and died off. So thankfully for India, not as deadly as it was in Thailand, when usually India does cop the more fatalities from these storms. So a little bit thankful for that, but amazing track of this storm. Really reminds me of the 1891 Siam typhoon as well, which was another similar one to this, which may have been worse in terms of strength, but possibly not in terms of actual impacts. So these two storms really stick out, along with some of the more modern examples like Typhoon Gay in 1989, and a few others in more recent years. I can't actually think of many that we've had in recent years. So certainly Thailand, probably its deadliest storm ever. and I still don't think they'd be prepared for this if it happened again today.
When you look at the only statistics that we actually have, 11,650 were killed by this storm, 650 in India. That's the 74th highest worldwide. In terms of buildings destroyed, 700,000 we have on record, which is the 7th highest ever recorded.
That concludes the top 10 forgotten cyclones that should be famous. Let's recap the top 10. Ruth in 1951. Hurricane 6L in 1870. Cyclone Nigel in 1985. Typhoon Virginia in 1957. Typhoon 10 in 1917. Typhoon Gilda in 1974. Cyclone 13 in 1971. Typhoon Fitow in 2013. Typhoon Vera in 1989. And Typhoon 28 in 1942.